In this video, we're going to talk about the bigger picture, or understanding biblical context. I want to tell you a story about something that happened to me way back in 2008 when I was a student in ecclesiology and eschatology. I had been working, nobody knew this, but about 2 years previous to getting into this eschatology class, I began working through the Greek New Testament. And those of you who have been working in the Greek New Testament, you know that you have to really slow down because that's not our native language. And if you're going to understand what's being communicated, you just have to go slower. Sometimes the question comes up, what's the difference between biblical theology and systematic theology? Hopefully, both theologies are biblical, but biblical theology generally is studying something more in its local context, like a particular book, whereas systematic theology is taking a doctrine and examining it in any particular book in light of all of the teachings on that subject and all of the scriptures. And as we're going to talk about in this class, context exists in layers, and we have to respect those different layers if we're going to understand even doctrine in a local context, in a particular book or in a particular paragraph. What happened to me in 2008 was, as I was working very slowly through the text, especially when I got the books like 2 Thessalonians that talk a lot about the day of the Lord, and it gives signs of the day of the Lord. In other words, signs of the tribulation, signs of the man of sin and what the man of sin would do. I thought, well, isn't it curious that he's giving them all these signs? If they were going to be raptured out, why would they need to know all of these details? And as I was going so slow through that text, I began to adopt more of a framework for a post-tribulational position. Well, as I wrote my paper, it was basically a post-trib paper. Dr. Oates was teaching at the time, Dr. Larry Oates. He was very kind. Well, he said, you can have 4 to 5 months. Why don't you work through this issue? And I basically ended writing a brand new theological paper on my position as it regards to, as it concerns Israel and the church, the nature of the kingdom, the nature of the millennium, and also the nature of the rapture. And as I worked through things more in terms of systematic theology now instead of biblical theology, came out more on the pre-tribulational side. And not that I don't see any passages that maybe are more challenging to that position, but I think the best position overall, when you take all the different texts into consideration, you'll come out on the pre-tribulational side of things. The reason I share this story is because I really want to point out context exists in layers, and when we're studying something in a local context, we have to respect the larger context, something that generally falls into the discipline of systematic theology. That's something we're going to continue to talk about in this class. So again, the lesson here is that we want to keep a good grip on systematic theology. Context exists in layers. When we say this, we mean that context certainly exists within the words themselves. We want to understand their semantics. We want to get at the meaning of the words. But then context exists in sentences, which of course is made up of words. And then sentences make up paragraphs. And paragraphs make up books. And books are what make up a testament. And then the 2 testaments are what make up the canon. And so when we're looking at, let's say, a specific verse or a specific paragraph in a particular book, we should do our best to understand in that local context what is being said. But sometimes there are some theological questions that come up, or even sometimes there are theological issues of which we may not be aware. But the more that we work through systematic theology, or we keep in mind the whole, the better we can hone in to better understand what we're looking at in a specific local context. So context exists in layers, and we want to respect that fact. I also want to point out here that context is both linguistic and conceptual. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, the linguistic context has to do with the fact that every word has a semantic range. And the words of a translation sometimes don't exactly overlap with their Greek equivalents. And so this means that we want to pay close attention to the Greek. But at the same time, every passage has a conceptual context. And the best way to grasp the conceptual context is probably by just being familiar with the Bible in our own native tongue. And so the more we study the English Bible, the more that we listen to it, the more we get a good grasp of the conceptual context. And the conceptual context is kind of what keeps us honest systematically. Then the linguistic context, when we're looking at particular words, let's say in Greek, that may not overlap exactly with the word we might choose to translate it by in English, is what will keep us honest on that local level. But we want to preserve and protect both of these contexts. Now let me show an illustration here. This is the best one I could do on a Google image search. I was looking for something a little more mature, but I found the Flintstones. And some of you may have played the game before where you look at two pictures, one is slightly different than the other, and you've got to try to find that difference. So if you take a look at these two pictures, it'll probably take you about 10 seconds to find out what the difference between the two is. Now if I was to ask you the question, well, which one is a better reflection of the actual Flintstone family? That's kind of a dumb question because they both are a very good reflection. There you've got Fred, his wife, and their pet dinosaur. It's been, a good 25 years since I've watched the program, so forgive me if I don't remember their names. But okay, the difference we can see is the collar on the dinosaur. But both give a pretty accurate reflection of these cartoon characters. And this is kind of the idea of the linguistic versus the conceptual context. We could say that, let's say on the left is the fine differences that sometimes exist between Greek and a version or a translation of the Greek. But usually it's pretty minor because if we say, let's say the left is a linguistic context, on the right we have the conceptual context, maybe we're not reading in the original language, but at the same time we can form theological ideas or convictions that are rooted in the scriptures, that are rooted in the nature of God himself. And so these should be complementary, and we should never get the idea that just because maybe God has blessed us with the ability to read Greek that somehow we know much more than the average layman. We want to be very careful with that. Greek is a wonderful tool, but respect both the conceptual context, something that we normally best get when we're familiar with the Bible in our own language, and the linguistic context, something that can also be a blessing and sometimes can help us refine our theology, especially in certain local contexts. So we best familiarize ourselves with the conceptual context, at least initially, by studying the Bible in our own language. So let's talk about how to study context. Now looking at this picture, boy, I must have married a millennial or something, which I did. Well, the Greek New Testament along with a version of the Bible, a good version of the Bible in our own language, will help us to nail the context. And we're going to point out here that the Bible is really its own best commentary. So how do we study context? Well, we want to be a student of the larger context. To do this, we need to be reading through the Bible regularly. Some people read through the Bible once a year. Some people might change to between versions. Of course, we want to be reading good versions of the Bible that are responsibly done, but maybe change versions to have a better grasp of what's being said, especially in some of those more difficult passages. But be reading through the Bible regularly. Another part of this is just going to church services regularly, where we can continually more familiarize ourselves with the biblical context. But be reading through the Bible regularly and respect differences between the New Testament and the Old Testament. There's quite a few differences. One of the main ones is Old Testament Israel was a national entity, whereas the church is a spiritual entity. And so, the lawyers, when we read the Gospels, we see that the lawyers were the ones who were the best fitted to comment on spiritual realities because they were the scribes of the Old Testament scriptures. But a lot of times the religious people are the ones who enforced the scriptures. And now the scriptures have influenced many 21st century societies, but we definitely play, those of us who interpret and teach and preach the scriptures, we play a very different role. The church is a spiritual entity. And that's just one difference among many. To be a good student of the context, we have to respect the differences between the testaments and then become familiar with books by the author, and particularly the book that's under consideration. We can ask ourselves what themes are being emphasized, which words are being used, and then read through the book in Greek, then in English, and then again in Greek. The linguistic and conceptual context should begin to merge. Generally, when I'm studying a book or going to be preaching from a book, I will read through it in Greek, generally a couple of times, and then I might go through the English. Now, most of my ministry is done in the Spanish-speaking world, so I'll generally read it in Spanish. Most of you will be reading it in English, and it's not even a bad idea. Maybe look over that passage in different good English versions, and then again in Greek. When we are familiar with the English, which is a little easier for us to process as a whole, we're refining that conceptual context. When we go back to the Greek, we're refining that linguistic context, and these two can merge, and all the while we're getting better with our Greek. And then select a paragraph for in-depth study. We want to ask ourselves, are there any grammatical or semantic peculiarities? Are there any maybe special or thematic vocabulary that appears? What words are being emphasized? What words appear more frequently than other words? Is there any teaching that's hard to understand? And at this point, it's a good idea to consult a study Bible, maybe some commentaries, maybe a New Testament introduction, Bible background commentaries, BDAG, which give us a good grasp of how particular words were used in Bible times. Generally, it's not a bad idea to take a look at the textual apparatus to see if there were any important textual variants that could affect the sense of the passage. And then we want to ask ourselves, what role does it play in the book's overall thrust? If we want to get a good grasp of the context, we need to be asking ourselves these questions, and remember to pay close attention to both the conceptual and the linguistic contexts.